Montana Territory, January 1884. Picture this. The wind sweeping down from the Bitterroot Range does not just blow, it hunts. It howls across the frozen clearings, carrying a dry, razor-sharp frost that solidifies grease in seconds, turns kerosene into thick slush, and freezes raw whiskey solid in the bottle. Out here, on the edge of the American frontier, winter is not just a season, it is a merciless predator. By dawn on January 14th, the heavy mercury thermometer hanging outside Samuel Pritchard's trading post plummeted to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a brutal, deadly kind of cold. The kind of cold that snaps green pine logs like dried twigs, cracks iron stoveplates, and drains human heat faster than a body can produce it. Inside the log cabins scattered across the valley, families were in full survival mode. Fires roared frantically in iron stoves and stone hearths. Men worked until their knuckles bled, hauling split timber from shrinking wood piles, feeding flames that devoured half a cord of wood every 18 hours, just to keep interior temperatures hovering barely above 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Water buckets froze solid inches from the hearth. Ice formed thick sheets on the inner side of log walls. Children slept, bundled in layers of elk hides and damp wool blankets, pressed together like livestock, while their parents stayed awake through the night, terrified that if the fire died for even 2 hours, their families would never wake up. Yet, 2 miles west of the settlement, standing alone in a snow-covered clearing, sat a strange structure. It had no sharp corners, no square timber walls, and no massive clouds of black smoke pouring from its chimney. To anyone passing by, it looked like a rounded grain silo or a medieval stone tomb. But inside that circular sandstone tower, something almost miraculous was happening. Duncan MacLeod, a 52-year-old Scottish stonemason, sat comfortably at his wooden table in his linen shirt sleeves. No heavy buffalo coat, no woolen gloves. The air inside his tower registered a steady, gentle 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And the most shocking part of all, he had burned less than 18 pounds of firewood over the last 18 hours. While his neighbors were burning through hundreds of pounds of wood just to keep their feet from freezing, MacLeod was living in early summer warmth, spending only a fraction of their fuel. How did a simple stone structure, built by a man everyone mocked as a fool just 3 months earlier, outperform every log cabin within 50 miles? How did an old Highland stonemason turn sandstone blocks and river rocks into a thermal fortress that held heat for 11 hours after the last ember died out? The secret he used was not magic. It was survival physics that the modern world forgot, a blueprint for warmth that turned mockery into total mastery. Before we open up the exact blueprints and measurements that shattered every rule of frontier building, take a second right now to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below, letting me know where you are watching from. And tell me, how much wood do you burn during the worst winter freeze? Because by the time this story ends, you will never look at stone, fire, or cold weather survival the same way again. To understand how Duncan MacLeod achieved what seemed impossible to every builder in Montana Territory, you have to go back to the spring of 1883. Duncan had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley with little more than a battered set of mason trowels, an iron sledgehammer, and memories of Highland winters that could freeze a man in his tracks. For 20 years in Scotland, he had worked dry stone, building root cellars, boundary walls, and fortified croft houses designed to keep crofters alive when oceanic gales swept across the barren moors. When he arrived in Montana, he found a growing community of homesteaders rushing to build their lives before the autumn frost. The standard way of building was simple, fast, and unquestioned. You notched heavy pine, or Douglas fir logs, stacked them 8 to 10 feet high, chinked the gaps with mud, clay, and dry moss, sealed the exterior seams with pine pitch, and stuck a stone hearth or a cast-iron stove inside. Everyone built this way. Master carpenters who had built homes in Minnesota and Wisconsin assured new arrivals that log cabins were the gold standard of frontier survival. Duncan MacLeod looked at their construction plans and saw death traps. He watched his neighbors cut down green timber, notch the green wood, and stack it into rectangular boxes. He knew what would happen when winter arrived and the wood began to dry and shrink. Logs would twist, chinking would dry out, crack, and crumble under the force of relentless Arctic winds. Tiny, invisible gaps would open up across every square foot of the wall, allowing cold air to pull heat straight out of the room through convective loss. Here is what everyone missed about wood. Wood is a decent insulator, but as an insulator, it resists holding thermal energy. A thick log wall might block cold wind for a few hours, but the moment your fire drops to embers, the room temperature plunges almost instantly. Wood has no thermal memory. It cannot store heat in its mass. You burn wood to warm the air, but air is light, volatile, and quickly escapes through roof seams, door frames, and floorboards. In an extreme freeze, living in a standard log cabin means running a continuous, exhausting rat race against physics. You cut wood endlessly to feed a fire that warms air that immediately escapes. If you get sick, if you hurt your back splitting timber, or if your wood pile gets buried under 6 feet of snow, your shelter fails. Winter on the frontier was fundamentally a math problem. How many cords of wood can one man chop and split before deep snow locks the forest? How many pounds of dry fuel must you burn every single night just to keep your family's lungs from freezing? Duncan realized that building a standard log cabin meant tying survival to continuous physical labor. He wanted a shelter that worked for him, a shelter that stored heat energy like a bank account and paid it back slowly over time. In late September of 1883, the settlement held an informal council in Samuel Pritchard's store to organize winter preparations. When it was Duncan's turn to speak, the Scotsman laid out his plan. His thick Highland accent filled the quiet room. He explained that he would not be building a log cabin. Instead, he intended to quarry local sandstone from a ridge 4 miles north and build a circular tower, 16 feet in diameter, walls 2 feet thick, with a central firebox set low into the ground and masonry flues running through the floor mass. He promised them that his stone tower would hold heat longer and burn less wood than any cabin in the territory. The council room went silent for 3 seconds. Then, Raymond Kerr, a respected master carpenter from Minnesota who had spent 30 years building timber frame structures, let out a loud laugh. Kerr shook his head and looked at Duncan like he was looking at a madman. He told Duncan flatly that stone draws cold like a sponge draws water. He argued that stone was cold to the touch, hard to work, and had no place in a northern winter. "You need wood," Kerr declared. "You need thick timber, air insulation, and dry chinking. If you spend the winter inside a stone cylinder, old man, you will freeze to death before January." Other homesteaders chimed in. Calvin Hodge, a farmer from Ohio who had weathered 3 harsh winters, agreed with Kerr. Hodge argued that a stone structure would take months to warm up and would turn into a hollow icebox the second the fire went out. Samuel Pritchard, acting as the settlement's de facto leader, tried to be polite, but even he advised Duncan against the project. Pritchard pointed out that winter was coming fast. The first snows were only weeks away, and winter was no time to experiment with strange Scottish ideas. Duncan MacLeod did not argue. He had lived long enough to know that words rarely convince men whose minds are set by tradition. Some men only learn when winter teaches them. He simply nodded, thanked them for their advice, picked up his hat, and walked back out into the cool autumn air. By mid-October, while the rest of the settlement was putting the finishing touches on their log cabins, hoisting timber roof beams, and plastering mud chinking into log seams, Duncan was just beginning his backbreaking work. Every morning before sunrise, he hitched his draft horse to a heavy wooden sled and hauled sandstone blocks from the northern ridge. Each stone block weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. He selected sandstone carefully, looking for dense, fine-grained rock that would hold together without crumbling under heat stress. Neighbors riding past the clearing stopped their horses just to watch him work. They watched the 52-year-old stonemason work his trowel with the precise, deliberate patience of a jeweler. First, he dug a circular trench 3 feet deep into the earth, well below the frost line. He filled the bottom with coarse river gravel for drainage, then laid a heavy ring foundation of solid limestone. On top of that foundation, he began stacking sandstone blocks. setting them with a custom mortar mix of slaked lime, fine sand, and sticky clay. The mocking started almost immediately. Passersby shouted jokes from the trail. One trapper called out that Duncan was building a grain silo without a farm. Another homesteader muttered that the Scotsman was building a very expensive, very heavy tomb for himself. Calvin Hodge made a show of checking his own massive woodpile, shouting over to Duncan that he had better start cutting timber soon, unless he planned to burn his mortar tools for warmth. Raymond Kerr went even further. He made it a point at the Sunday community gatherings to explain to everyone why Duncan's tower was doomed by physics. Kerr explained to the crowd that if you touch a wooden wall in winter, it feels soft and neutral, but if you touch a stone wall, it instantly pulls the heat right out of your skin. Stone has high thermal conductivity, Kerr insisted. It acts like a giant suction pipe, pulling heat out of the room and dumping it into the frozen air outside. Kerr was not entirely wrong about the surface sensation of stone, but he was making a fatal scientific mistake. He was confusing surface heat conduction with volumetric thermal mass. He did not understand that while stone feels cold initially, because it absorbs heat rapidly, once that stone mass is saturated with energy, it turns into a massive heat storage battery. Kerr saw only the surface of the stone block. Duncan saw the raw weight, density, and volume of 4,200 pounds of dense sandstone working together as a single thermal engine. By late November, as the first steady snow began to cover the Bitterroot Valley, the stone tower was finally taking shape. It rose 12 feet high, a perfect circle 16 feet across, with walls 24 inches thick. The circular design was not an aesthetic choice. It was a stroke of pure survival engineering. A rectangle cabin has 4 cold corners where warm air gets trapped, cools down, and creates stagnant drafts. A circle minimizes surface area relative to interior volume, reducing wind resistance, and eliminating cold corners where heat loss is highest. Cold Arctic winds could not hit a flat wall. They simply swept smoothly around the curved stone surface. Inside the tower, Duncan was building the heart of his system. In the exact center of the stone floor, he built a firebox set 18 inches deep into the earth. It was not built against an exterior wall like a standard fireplace, where half the heat radiates straight into the outdoors. It sat right in the middle of the room. He surrounded the firebox with dense, rounded river stones, granite, and basalt that he had spent all summer collecting from the riverbed. From the firebox, Duncan carved shallow, stone-lined channels that spiraled outward across the floor before connecting to a vertical chimney set on the north side of the building. Smoke and hot exhaust gases from the central firebox could not simply rush straight up and out a roof flue. Instead, they were forced to travel through these floor channels, passing their intense heat into the solid stone floor beneath his feet before the cooled smoke finally escaped up the chimney. This was an ancient concept, refined over thousands of years. The Romans had used subterranean hypocausts to heat their stone baths. The Koreans used ondol systems to channel heat beneath stone floors. The Russians built massive masonry stoves called pechkas that stored heat from a single daily burn. Duncan was bringing centuries of proven Eurasian thermal engineering to the harsh frontier of Montana, using nothing but local sandstone, river rocks, and hand-mixed mortar. The walls themselves were constructed as a double-withe masonry system. He laid an inner wall of dressed sandstone blocks and an outer wall of heavy stone, leaving a dense core between them packed tight with lime mortar, small stones, and clay. This massive wall assembly created a controlled thermal gradient. When a fire burned in the central firebox, the interior surface of the stone wall warmed up first. That heat then conducted slowly into the dense middle core of the wall. The outer surface stayed cool enough to minimize thermal loss to the outside air, while the inner core absorbed thousands of British thermal units of heat energy. By the first week of December, Duncan installed a single heavy wooden door on the south side of the tower, facing away from the prevailing north winds. He cut one small double-paned window facing east to catch the early morning sunlight, and built a simple sleeping loft made of thick pine planks tucked along the western curve of the upper wall. The roof was built with heavy timber rafters covered with a thick layer of sod and earth. providing another massive layer of insulation on top of the structure. Neighbors came by to look at the finished tower, but few stepped inside. To men accustomed to square cabins with high ceilings, iron stoves, and glass windows, Duncan's tower looked alien, dark, and uncomfortable. Raymond Kerr stood in the doorway, looked at the central firebox and the thick stone walls, and shook his head with pity. "You built yourself an oven, Duncan," Kerr said coldly. "Come January, you are either going to bake alive or freeze solid. Either way, it is sheer madness." Duncan just sat on his wooden bench, running a wet whetstone over his carving knife. He looked up at Kerr, smiled gently, and said, "We will see, Raymond. Winter is coming. We will see." By mid-December, the friendly teasing in the settlement turned into serious betting. Homesteaders had little cash, but they had goods, livestock, and labor. Calvin Hodge bet a cured smoked ham that Duncan would abandon his stone tower and move into someone's hayloft before February. Raymond Kerr wagered 2 full days of custom carpentry work that Duncan's fuel consumption would be twice as high as any wooden cabin in the settlement. Eugene Ferris, a rugged trapper who spent his winters on the trap line, put up a prime beaver pelt, betting that the interior temperature of the stone tower would never break 50 degrees Fahrenheit during a serious cold wave. Duncan heard about the bets, but he paid no attention. While his neighbors were feverishly hauling cord after cord of wood into massive piles beside their cabins, Duncan stacked a modest supply of split pine and Douglas fir inside his tower. He kept his fuel indoors, where the warm, dry air brought the wood to zero moisture content. Dry wood burns cleaner, hotter, and releases its heat far more efficiently than the snow-covered, half-frozen logs his neighbors were tossing into their iron stoves. He also kept a stack of smooth river stones piled next to his firebox. When Eugene Ferris stopped by one afternoon and asked why he was hoarding river rocks, Duncan just shrugged and said it was an old Highland trick. He told Ferris that stone remembers what wood forgets. Ferris laughed, mounted his horse, and rode off into the gathering clouds. By Christmas, the winter of 1883 began to show its true teeth. The temperature plunged into the single digits, then dropped below zero. The wind picked up, driving fine snow into every crack and crevice across the valley. In the log cabins, the battle had begun. Families were forced to keep their stoves burning red-hot 24 hours a day. The constant draft, created by burning iron stoves, pulled cold outdoor air through tiny gaps in the wall chinking, creating a relentless cycle of freezing drafts along the floor and scorched air near the ceiling. Men woke up every 2 hours throughout the night to throw more logs into their hearths. Exhaustion began to set in. Wood piles were shrinking far faster than anyone had calculated. And yet, inside the circular stone tower, Duncan MacLeod was sleeping soundly through 8 hours of dark, quiet night. His central firebox burned low and steady, its heat soaking deep into the thousands of pounds of sandstone and river stones surrounding him. The stage was set. The skeptics had placed their bets. The timber cabins were consuming wood like locomotives, and the true test of Montana's coldest winter was about to crash down upon the Bitterroot Valley. Now, picture this. To truly grasp why Duncan MacLeod's tower was outperforming every cabin in the territory, you have to look past the stone surface and examine the hidden engineering taking place inside those sandstone walls. What the master carpenters and frontier homesteaders failed to understand was a fundamental law of thermodynamics. They believed that insulation was the only defense against cold weather. But insulation only resists heat flow. It does not store energy. Duncan was playing a completely different game. He was utilizing the power of thermal mass. Think about that for a second. Sandstone, the dense rock Duncan quarried from the northern ridge, has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 0.17 British thermal units per cubic inch per degree Fahrenheit. In practical terms, that means every single cubic foot of Duncan's 2-foot-thick sandstone walls could absorb and store approximately 30 British thermal units of heat energy for every single degree its temperature was raised. Let that sink in. Do the math on Duncan's tower. A circular structure, 16 feet in diameter with walls 24 inches thick, rising 12 feet high, contains roughly 4,200 pounds of dense sandstone mass not counting the heavy river stones packed around the central firebox and floor flues. When Duncan raised the temperature of that massive stone structure from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, he was not just heating the air inside the room, he was charging a massive thermal battery with over 126,000 British thermal units of stored heat energy. That amount of energy is roughly equivalent to burning nearly 4 pounds of dry firewood all at once. But here's the cold, hard truth about how wood fires behave in standard log cabins. When you burn 4 pounds of wood in an open fireplace or an iron stove, that heat spikes rapidly into the air, flashes across the room, and escapes through roof gaps within 30 minutes. In Duncan's tower, that heat energy was absorbed directly into the stone walls and stone floor. Instead of vanishing into the sky, the thermal energy was locked inside 4,200 pounds of rock. And then, over the next 10 to 12 hours, those sandstone walls slowly, steadily radiated that heat back into the living space. Here is what everyone missed about Duncan's central heating system. Standard frontier fireplaces were built into exterior walls. Half of their radiant heat went straight outside, warming the wilderness instead of the cabin. Duncan placed his firebox dead center in the middle of the circular room. Every single calorie of combustion heat released from his dry pine logs had nowhere to go except into the surrounding river stones and the solid sandstone floor. Even more brilliant was his subterranean flue design. Instead of allowing hot exhaust smoke to travel straight up a vertical chimney, Duncan forced the smoke to travel outward through shallow stone channels carved directly beneath his floorboards. As the hot smoke spiraled through these stone channels toward the northern chimney, it transferred its heat into the stone floor beneath his feet. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney on the north side, it had given up almost all its thermal energy to the building itself. The entire floor became a massive radiant heating panel. Duncan had built a floor-based radiant heating system using nothing more than sandstone, river rock, and simple physical geometry. Furthermore, his wall construction utilized a double-withe masonry technique. He built an inner wall surface of dressed sandstone, an outer wall facing the elements, and packed the center tightly with lime mortar, small stones, and clay. This created a controlled thermal gradient across the wall assembly. When the central fire was burning, the inner stone face warmed up quickly. The dense mortar core absorbed and held that warmth like a reservoir, while the outer stone surface stayed cool enough to minimize thermal radiation loss to the frigid outside air. And then there was the geometry itself. A rectangular cabin creates flat barrier walls that take the full, crushing force of Arctic winds. When a 60-mile-per-hour wind hits a flat log wall, it creates a high-pressure zone on the windward side that forces freezing air through tiny cracks in the chinking, while creating a low-pressure vacuum on the leeward side that literally pulls warm air out of the building. Duncan's circular design eliminated flat surfaces completely. Arctic winds could not grab hold of his building. They simply glided smoothly around the curved stone surface. Wind resistance was cut in half, wind-driven drafts were eliminated, and cold air infiltration fell to zero. By January 1884, winter stopped playing games. The weather turned from a standard northern freeze into an historic Arctic maelstrom. The cold came down from the Canadian Yukon in waves. First came a sharp drop on January 9th, plunging temperatures down to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Then came a brief, deceptive lull, followed by a relentless Arctic surge that shattered glass thermometers and froze standing timber until trees split open with sounds like rifle shots echoing through the valley. On January 11th, the mercury touched minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and on the morning of January 14th, Samuel Pritchard's mercury thermometer registered a staggering minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit just after dawn. That was a lethal level of cold. A man caught outside without leather gloves and fur wrapping would suffer severe frostbite in under 5 minutes. Exposed skin froze almost instantly. Across the Bitterroot Valley, the homesteaders were living through a nightmare. Inside Calvin Hodge's log cabin, the cold had completely breached his defenses. Hodge woke up at 4 in the morning to find a thick sheet of white frost covering the interior side of his log walls. His iron stove, fed continuously through the night by his eldest son, radiated intense, scorching heat within a narrow 3-foot circle. But beyond that tiny circle, the air inside the cabin hovered barely at 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Hodge's wife had wrapped their younger children in thick elk hides and kept them sitting on wooden stools right next to the iron stove. The family was burning through 80 pounds of split firewood every 18 hours just to keep their drinking water from turning into solid ice inside their iron kettle. Their hands were blistered from splitting wood, their wood pile was disappearing at an alarming rate, and the cold draft sweeping across the floorboards was so severe that candles flickered on the kitchen table. Raymond Kerr's timber frame cabin was faring slightly better, but only because he was a master carpenter who had sealed his seams with obsessive care. Yet even Kerr could not maintain his interior temperature above 52 degrees Fahrenheit without running his stove continuously. His fingers were cramped from swinging an axe in sub-zero cold. His wood stockpile was depleted by more than half, and his family was forced to sleep in full winter coats, huddled together under every quilt they owned. Everywhere in the settlement, it was the exact same story. Roaring fires, vanishing timber stockpiles, freezing corners, exhausted men, and families praying for an early thaw. And that is when Eugene Ferris, the trapper, rode past Duncan MacLeod's stone tower. Ferris was checking his trap line along the frozen river, wrapped in layers of heavy furs until he looked like a walking grizzly bear. His face was numb. His eyelashes were white with frost, and every breath he took felt like inhaling broken glass. As he rode past Duncan's clearing, he stopped his horse and stared at the stone tower in utter confusion. Something was wrong. Ferris looked up at the stone chimney on the north side of the tower. There was no massive, billowing plume of dark black smoke, the kind of heavy smoke that poured from every cabin stove in the valley as homesteaders frantically shoved wood into their fires. Instead, all that rose from Duncan's chimney was a thin, almost invisible ribbon of clear heat distortion, rising lazily into the freezing air. Ferris felt a sudden knot of dread in his stomach. He assumed the worst. He thought the Scotsman had finally succumbed to the cold. He figured Duncan's fire had gone out, the stone tower had turned into an icebox, and the old stonemason was lying frozen inside his stone tomb. Ferris dismounted his horse, trudged through 3 feet of powdery snow, and approached the tower door. As he reached out his gloved hand to knock, he stumbled and leaned his forearm against the exterior sandstone wall to catch his balance. What happened next stopped Eugene Ferris dead in his tracks. He pulled off his thick leather glove and pressed his bare palm directly against the sandstone block. He expected the stone to burn his skin with Arctic frost. Instead, his bare hand felt a gentle, unmistakable, soothing warmth radiating directly from the rock itself. It was not hot enough to burn, but it was unquestionably warm, like a sun-baked rock sitting in a meadow on a late August afternoon. Ferris blinked in total disbelief. He stared at his bare hand, then stared at the stone wall. The outside air was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the solid stone wall of Duncan's tower was radiating gentle heat into his palm. Ferris pounded his fist against the heavy wooden door. Within 4 seconds, the door swung smoothly inward. Duncan MacLeod stood there in the doorway. He was wearing simple wool trousers and a light linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. No heavy winter coat, no sheepskin vest, no wool gloves. His skin was relaxed, his cheeks were flushed with comfortable warmth, and he held a steaming mug of black tea in his hand. Behind him, the interior of the circular tower glowed with a warm, golden ambient light. There was no roaring fire blasting wildly in the center of the room. In the central firebox, there were only 3 modest, low-burning pine logs resting on a bed of glowing coals, surrounded by those rounded river stones Duncan had collected months earlier. Those river stones were glowing with a dull red hue, pumping stored thermal energy into the air. "Eugene," Duncan said with a quiet smile, "step inside, man. Cold enough out there for you?" Ferris stood frozen on the threshold, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Outside, the wilderness was locked in a killing freeze that was breaking record temperatures across the territory. Inside, a man was standing in his shirt sleeves, relaxing in comfortable room warmth that felt like an early summer evening. Ferris took a step across the threshold, and Duncan pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him. Stay with me here, because what happened next shattered every assumption the settlement had made about survival building. The instant the door closed, a deep, penetrating warmth wrapped around Ferris. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove that burns your face while your back remains freezing cold. It was an enveloping, three-dimensional heat that seemed to radiate from everywhere at once. The warm floor was heating his frozen boots. The curved, sandstone walls were radiating gentle thermal energy against his back. The air was still, quiet, and completely free of drafts. Ferris pulled off his heavy fur cap, unbuttoned his heavy coat, and walked over to the stone wall. He pressed both bare hands flat against the sandstone blocks. The interior stone surface was comfortably warm to the touch, roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit. "How much wood are you burning in here, Duncan?" Ferris asked, his voice barely above an astonished whisper. Duncan took a sip of his hot tea and shrugged his shoulders. 3, maybe 4 small pieces of split fir every few hours, he answered calmly. I built up a nice little fire around 5 o'clock this morning to charge the stones. Added 2 small logs at 8. I likely won't need to put another stick on until noon. Ferris did the calculations in his head, and his jaw dropped. Duncan was burning less than 20 pounds of firewood a day. The other families in the valley were burning 80 to 100 pounds a day, working themselves to exhaustion, and still shivering in cabins that barely held 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Duncan was maintaining summer comfort while consuming less than 1/4 of their firewood supply. I have to get Samuel Pritchard, Ferris stammered, staring at the central firebox. I have to go tell the others right now. Duncan smiled gently and nodded his head. Go tell them, Eugene, he said quietly. But tell them the truth. This is not magic. It is just stone. And stone remembers heat long after wood forgets. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 14th, word had spread like wildfire across the settlement of 43 souls. A crowd of frozen homesteaders gathered outside Duncan MacLeod's stone tower. They stood in snow up to their knees, their faces wrapped tightly in wool scarves against wind that could strip skin, breath fogging heavily in the bitter air. They had come to see the impossible with their own eyes. Samuel Pritchard arrived, carrying his official brass mercury thermometer and a leather-bound notebook. As the settlement's record-keeper and a former Army quartermaster, Pritchard understood the value of documentation. If Duncan's design was real, if this was not some strange fluke or exaggeration, then it needed to be measured, recorded, and verified under strict conditions. Duncan opened the door and invited Pritchard inside. The instant Pritchard stepped across the threshold, the heat hit him like a summer breeze. He stood in the doorway for a moment, disoriented by the rapid shift from -38 degrees Fahrenheit outside to the lush, quiet warmth inside the room. Pritchard held up his brass thermometer in the center of the room, roughly 6 feet from the central firebox. He watched the mercury rise rapidly. When the reading stabilized, Pritchard checked it twice, held it up to the lantern light, and wrote the numbers in his notebook. Interior temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:15 in the afternoon, January 14th, 1884. Pritchard stepped back outside to address the shivering crowd. He held up his thermometer to show them the outdoor reading, -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The air had warmed up slightly since dawn, but it was still cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. 68 degrees inside, Pritchard announced to the crowd, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, measured at room center, 6 feet from the hearth. Raymond Kerr pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his scarf pulled down below his chin, his face pale with disbelief. And how much wood has he burned to hold that temperature? Kerr demanded. Duncan gestured to a tiny pile of split fir near his doorway. That is what I have burned since yesterday evening, Duncan said softly. About 16 pieces. Maybe 18 pounds total? Calvin Hodge stepped forward, staring at the tiny wood pile with a look that hovered between absolute shock and deep frustration. 18 pounds, Hodge muttered, rubbing his hand over his tired face. I have burned 80 pounds of timber since yesterday afternoon. 80 pounds. And my cabin is barely holding 44 degrees right now. My water bucket froze solid overnight. Hodge's wife added quietly from behind him, wrapping her shawl tighter around her infant child. Pritchard began taking comparative measurements across the settlement. Over the next hour, he walked from cabin to cabin, recording temperature and fuel consumption data. The results were stark and undeniable. At Calvin Hodges' cabin, the interior temperature was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, with 80 pounds of wood consumed in 18 hours. At Raymond Kerr's tight timber cabin, the temperature was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, with 65 pounds of wood consumed in 18 hours. At Eugene Ferris's trapper cabin, the temperature was 48 degrees Fahrenheit, with 70 pounds of wood burned in 18 hours. And, at Duncan MacLeod's circular sandstone tower, the interior temperature was a steady, warm 68 degrees Fahrenheit, with only 18 pounds of wood consumed in 18 hours. The math was brutal and absolute. Duncan was maintaining an interior temperature 16 to 24 degrees warmer than his neighbors, while burning less than 1/4 of their firewood. The temperature difference between outdoor air and indoor comfort in Duncan's tower was a massive 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Then came the final experiment that settled the argument forever. That evening, Samuel Pritchard asked Duncan if they could test the tower's thermal retention. He wanted Duncan to extinguish his fire completely and measure how long the stone mass would hold warmth against the freezing Arctic night. Duncan agreed without hesitation. At 6 in the evening, Duncan placed one final log on his firebox. At 8 o'clock, he allowed the fire to burn down to red coals. By 9 in the evening, the flames were completely extinguished. No active fire burned inside the tower. Pritchard stayed inside the tower all night, sitting at the table with his notebook, taking hourly temperature readings. At 9 at night, the room temperature was 66 degrees Fahrenheit. At 10 at night, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. At 11 at night, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. At midnight, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1 in the morning, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2 in the morning, 56 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3 in the morning, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. At 4 in the morning, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And at 5 in the morning, 11 full hours after the last flame died out, the interior temperature was still 51 degrees Fahrenheit. For 11 hours, without a single stick of wood burning, 4,200 pounds of heated sandstone and river rock had released their stored thermal energy at a rate of roughly 1.4 degrees per hour. In standard log cabins without an active fire, interior temperatures dropped below 50 degrees within 2 hours. Pritchard wrote his final entry in his notebook before dawn. Duncan MacLeod's stone tower demonstrates a heat retention capacity 350 to 400% greater than conventional log construction, with fuel consumption reduced by 75%. Previous assumptions regarding stone's unsuitability for cold weather housing have been proven entirely incorrect. The next morning, Raymond Kerr walked over to Duncan's tower alone. The master carpenter stood in the doorway, looked Duncan in the eye, and spoke without pride. "I was wrong, Duncan," Kerr said plainly. "I did not understand thermal mass, but I was wrong. Will you teach me how to build with stone?" Duncan smiled, stepped aside, and gestured to a wooden stool. "Come in, Raymond. We will start with the floor flues." The transformation across the valley did not happen overnight, but it moved with unstoppable momentum. By late January, Duncan's tower had turned into an informal classroom. Homesteaders who had mocked him months earlier sat inside his warm room, sketching flue channels, learning mortar mixtures, and taking notes on stone selection. Raymond Kerr incorporated Duncan's methods into his own woodworking business. He designed a hybrid building style that combined the quick setup of timber frames with a thick stone hearth and masonry heat storage core built around iron stoves. When Kerr built his new stone hearth in February, his family slept through the night without waking up once to feed the fire, and his fuel consumption dropped by 40%. Eugene Ferris adopted Duncan's river rock technique for his backcountry trapline, heating river stones in evening campfires, wrapping them in leather, and tucking them into his bedroll to stay warm for 8 hours in sub-zero wilderness. By autumn of 1884, 12 homesteaders in the Bitterroot Valley had integrated thermal mass heating into their homes. When winter returned late that year, the settlement's total firewood consumption dropped by an estimated 30%. In 1885, A regional surveyor named Marcus Webb documented 17 buildings within a 50-mile radius built using what locals called the McLeod method. Webb interviewed Duncan for an territorial engineering report, asking the old Scotsman if he felt vindicated after enduring so much mockery. Duncan shook his head and gave an answer that every survivor should remember. "I did not build this tower to prove anyone wrong," Duncan said softly. "I built it to survive." The real satisfaction comes from knowing that families are warmer, safer, using less wood, and suffering less. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Duncan MacLeod's stone tower stood in the Bitterroot Valley for 43 years. It outlasted almost every wooden cabin built in 1883. When it was finally taken down in 1927 to make way for a county road, the sandstone blocks were carefully salvaged and used to build the central stone hearth in the town's new community center. Old Raymond Kerr, by then a gray-haired elder, helped lay those stones with his own hands. There is a lesson in Duncan MacLeod's story that goes far beyond stone, wood, and thermal mass calculations. It is a lesson about humility, about the danger of assuming that the familiar way of doing things is the only way. The homesteaders who mocked Duncan were not foolish men. They were skilled, hard-working people, but they had confused familiarity with superiority. They assumed that because everyone built log cabins were the ultimate design. Physics does not care about tradition or human ego. Thermal mass works whether you believe in it or not. Stone stores thermal energy whether you understand thermodynamics or not. When winter arrives, indifferent and brutal, it strips away opinions and leaves behind only the hard, unyielding truth of physical law. Educational note: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current building codes and safety guidelines. Duncan MacLeod remembered wisdom that his ancestors had refined over centuries of highland winters. That knowledge was not primitive. It was engineering distilled to its absolute essence through the unforgiving feedback of human survival. If this story changed how you think about traditional building wisdom, off-grid survival, or the power of thermal mass engineering, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of forgotten frontier ingenuity, and leave a comment below telling me, what traditional building skill or survival method do you think modern society needs to rediscover today? Thanks for watching. Stay warm, stay prepared, and remember, the past is not primitive, it is proven.